Thank you very much, Malcolm, and particularly since you came back from Vancouver and arrived yesterday, and this must be about the time when jet lag starts to kick in, but I think you're an absolute stalwart, and thank you very much for giving some of your time. I mean, you're in the most interesting position because you are Chief Executive of Christchurch International Airport, which has reached the status of being climate positive, which I think you claim is a world first. Can you talk us through that, because it seems deeply fascinating?
Sure. Well, first, kia ora koutou, everybody. Yes, this is actually my last day of 3 weeks of international travel after two years. So tonight I get to go home. So it's great to be here. Look, climate change was a platform that we chose at Christchurch Airport following the earthquakes. Back in 2014, 3 years after the earthquakes, we'd been structurally dislocated as a business within aviation in this part of the world. And so part of the rebuilding of the business, the rebuilding of the culture, was to set down a challenge of, by 2025, what could we be known as world-class at, but also be known globally for. And after a lot of internal discussion, our team chose climate change as the thing that we would focus on. And so over the course of the years since then, we've become deeply, deeply focused in this and managed to move ourselves through not only understanding climate change in our business, climate change from a global perspective, but also how we needed to transition to address it in our own business. In 2020, we were accredited by the World Airports Council as the first airport in the world to reach the highest level of independently verified decarbonisation for any airport. And following that, we've now gone on to become climate positive. So we've driven roughly 90% of our Scope 1 emissions out of our business. That's the stuff we're directly responsible for. We've driven 20% of our Scope 2 emissions. That's the stuff that comes in through our supply chains, etc. And we now report fully on our Scope 3 emissions, which are our airline emissions. So we claim 50% of all the airline emissions in and out of Christchurch. We fully report on that every year. Our climate positivity comes from the work we've done in terms of Scope 1 and Scope 2. So we became carbon neutral in 2020. We were down to a very small offset level at that point, and our team wanted to go beyond that. So we now commit to currently offsetting 25% more of our footprint than we create. That will move to 50% and then 100%. Over the coming years, and that's our journey to climate positivity. There's a number of lessons in that, Fran, but what we understand is that we are the first airport in the world to achieve that on a scientific basis and independently verified. And arising from that, we've had a surprising number of invitations globally to coach other airports. So when we became the first in the world to reach the highest level for the Airports Council, we were contacted by the Ports Authority of New York City, which run the 3 New York airports, and we've engaged with them in terms of their decarbonisation processes, as well as a number of other airports in Australia, the UK, and in Europe and Ireland, and in North America. So at the moment, we're currently coaching about 20 airports in the world in terms of how to get to carbon neutral and ultimately how to get to carbon positive. But more important than that, I think Airports Council International, which is the global body for airports, has asked us if they can adopt the donut economics model that we created for Christchurch Airport as a level 5 for airports to attain in the world in terms of carbon positivity. So what the model we've created at Christchurch Airport will become the global standard for measuring all airports in terms of decarbonisation.
That's impressive. I mean, your story doesn't just stop there, does it? Because, I mean, you've got the developments in the solar space and also in hydrogen coming forward. So can you tell us a bit more about that? It seems the airport, after the horrible shake in February 2011, has been on this extraordinary mission, but you've also, you've kept going. You're not resting on your laurels.
That's right. I mean, as you start a journey like this, your opportunity opens up with your understanding, growing, etc. And one of the things we've learned is that no organisation in the world will decarbonise without adopting technology at the same time. Climate change is an energy transition process. You have to look at energy transition from an asset plan perspective. If I own a combustion engine car, I can't put electricity into it, so I have to change that asset as part of the process of dealing with climate change. For us, what we felt was we always wanted to play a role bigger than just an airport in terms of climate change. So we've actively looked to involve ourselves in partnerships that move that forward, whether it's a hydrogen partnership we have with a number of other airports in the world, whether it's working with an energy impact fund in Australia to establish a 400-hectare solar farm on our campus, which we announced last year, Kowhai Park. And that fund out of Australia has committed $100 million for stage one. We now have 5 global partners who are interested in that. But that's stage one of our development. Ultimately, we need to get to 4,000 hectares of solar in our part of the world if we're genuinely going to deal with not only our Scope 2, but also our Scope 3 emissions down the track as well.
I'm sure you were fascinated by Catherine McGowan earlier on with the WIS story, and I wouldn't mind just being a bit discursive here, because obviously the work you've been doing down there in AI, the autonomous vehicles, there must be an incredible fit, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, you can't deal with climate change without adopting technology at the same time. We've had a long relationship with WISC right back to their very, very early stages. Catherine spoke about regulators. I was fortunate enough in 2017 to be visiting these guys in San Francisco. At the time, they were having an argument with the Federal Aviation Authority over the need for a ballistic parachute on these aircraft. And their engineers were arguing that a digital one was more reliable. And I was sitting there going, how the hell can a digital parachute be more reliable than a ballistic parachute? A ballistic parachute is one that shoots out and you get a white chute if something goes wrong and the aircraft drifts down to the ground. But the engineers were pointing out that the configuration of the batteries, the fact that there are 12 vertical propellers and 1 horizontal propeller meant that the probability of a failure of all of the battery cells and all of the propulsion systems was incalculably small, and therefore at the very first fault, a digital parachute would return the aircraft to ground safely before any other fault could develop. And I just thought, this is incredible, very similar to the challenges that we had, and I know that the Omeo guys are in the room here, very similar to the challenges we had around autonomy with land-based transport. Ultimately, to get a trial up and running, the regulators in New Zealand required us to have someone inside the autonomous vehicle and someone driving a van in front of the autonomous vehicle. So instead of having a man with a van doing your transfers, we had a man with a van and an autonomous vehicle with a driver in it, and it just seemed a little bit ridiculous in terms of if you're really going to adopt autonomy, your regulatory framework needs to be there. Very similar, we had an issue that New Zealand, you're required to put your registration in the front windscreen of your car. Well, an autonomous vehicle goes forward and backwards, it has no front or back, so we couldn't comply with that regulation in terms of registering it for the road.
Obviously Catherine laid out an ambitious timetable for getting these electric vehicles flying, and the autonomous ones in particular. I mean, where does it fit in your own planning for the airport? When do you expect it all to occur?
Autonomy is an inevitable part of the transport system. The thought of being able to get in your car here and watch a movie and have a coffee and turn up in Whitianga without touching your steering wheel is a long, long way off. What we learned is that you have to digitise the entire environment in order to be able to achieve that level of autonomy. But what autonomy gives you is a level of efficiency that is just not available in the current structures. One of the things that's really interesting about WISC and also about electric aviation is it will create micro networks in New Zealand, and so If you use for those that might go to Coromandel for the summertime, if you use, Auckland to Whitianga, for example, it's a 2.5-hour drive. Micro networks, electric aircraft that are less than 12 seats that are autonomous. It might be $20 for you to fly every 30 minutes to Whitianga, for example. So the demand on infrastructure for airports is going to grow as a result of climate change because you're going to fly places that we haven't built the road infrastructure for you to be able to achieve. And therefore, autonomy coming to the skies in New Zealand over a medium distance, say less than 500 kilometres, is much closer than autonomy on the roads is at the moment in terms of open roads. In terms of on campus, around town sort of movement, autonomy is going to be the pathway of the future. So it kind of intrigues me when you look at rail systems to the airport, for example. Autonomous shuttles could do that on a northern busway style structure much more efficiently and effective and much more climate friendly.
Food for thought in Auckland as well. Yeah,
I'm in Christchurch, so
I know you are, but ideas can travel. Anyway, getting back to Christchurch Airport. I mean, what you're developing here, I mean, it's very holistic. It's very much on the edge. Shareholders, everyone completely behind it? Do you get total support?
Yeah, look, when you embark on a decarbonisation pathway like that, you've got to put some first principles in place. You've also got to put some guardrails in place. So the first principles were, if it's green but puts us in the red, it's not sustainable because someone's going to change it in the future. And the only changes we want to look at are forever changes. If it's not going to change the way we do our business forever, we're not interested in it. The third thing was that we were prepared to sacrifice 40 basis points on our internal rate of return. So if the business case didn't quite meet our internal hurdle rate but was within 40 basis points of it, then we would advance the asset transition. What we've found is that projects that couldn't get over the line in 2015-16 on that hurdle basis could get over the line in 2019-20 because the technology had become available or had become cheaper. And so we never shelved those projects. We just kept them on pause until we could meet that internal financial hurdle.
Just moving on from that, I'm just keen, you were on the Prime Minister's trip to Japan and Singapore, and just some perceptions of how we're playing out on the road again after so long.
Well, I think my first perception is we don't know how COVID has changed the world here in New Zealand because we really didn't have it. We had COVID after we were vaccinated. And the things that really sort of, surprised me was how, everything's the same, but everything's different. The amount of shops, the amount of Chinatown that was shut down in Singapore really, really shocked me. I had lunch at Boat Quay down on the river. I was the only person in 6 restaurants having lunch outside. So, we don't know how much COVID has changed the world here. In North America, we stayed 5 nights, I think, Stephen, at the hotel. When we checked in, we were told that our rooms wouldn't be serviced due to a lack of staff. If we wanted extra linen, we could call down for it, but our rooms would only be serviced on the way out. Now, that's actually, I've come to understand, fairly common across North America at the moment due to a lack of staff. The room service was only 5 till 10 at night due to a lack of staff, etc. So that's the first thing, is the world has changed dramatically, and we've been very insulated from that. The second thing is we always play well on the international stage. We always play well together on the international stage when we fly in formation. But we've got a lot of work to do to reconnect and be relevant again to a lot of the things that are happening. COVID has genuinely changed the perception of a lot of our customers, and you just don't pick that up over video calls. And so I would encourage, if you're in the international markets, you've got to wear some shoe leather out and relearn the world because it has changed.
Just a final area I'd like to close on. I mean, you've been a member of the APEC Business Advisory Council for some time. You've been leading the climate working group within that, and you've just been up in Vancouver, I think, for the first face-to-face meeting in
2 years.
2 years, correct. Yeah, what was your perception of meeting with international business? But second to that, how good a job is that group doing in climate, and I guess a follow-on, what do you expect to happen in APEC 2023 by the time the United States hosts?
Sure, well in climate in my area, I lead the 21 Economies Working Group on Climate. Climate is a new frontier for trade protectionism, and it's going to become really, really relevant within trade frameworks over the next decade to 20 years. There are not common frameworks across the Asia-Pacific region, whether it, functioning carbon trading markets, science-based targets, etc., science-based assessments. When it comes to New Zealand agricultural products trading internationally, climate and your carbon footprint is going to become, any product in New Zealand is going to become significant. I noticed that Minister O'Connor this morning said that, the tech sector is a carbon light sector. Well, that's just not the case. I mean, the data sector in the US has a bigger carbon footprint than the airline sector does. So, where you locate your data centres, are they on a green grid? Is it a brown grid, etc.? These are the types of things that are going to come into the trade framework over the next 10 or 20 years. So the really key thing for APEC is it's a useful forum to thrash out the areas that you need. Interoperability and modality were the two words that kept coming up in the last week.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions from the floor, so if you don't mind, I'll probably take another minute or two. Thought leaders globally, who's doing climate change best?
Nobody.
Who?
Nobody.
Nobody, okay. That's a quick answer. With international travel resuming, how likely are Scope 3 emissions also resuming to increase your emissions below carbon neutrality?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the number one driver of airline emissions during the pandemic was e-commerce. Parcel freight volumes rocketed across the world, and they drove up airline emissions. And if we look at New Zealand during the 2-month lockdown in 2020, 90% of aviation stopped, 60% of personal transport stopped, and New Zealand's emissions fell by 3%. So there's no question that increasing international travel will lift Scope 3 emissions. It's a wicked problem, but globally we have to deal with that because human behaviour is still consuming that transport network in a growing way.
And another question here, there are 5 levels of autonomy. How do you best explain the various levels of autonomy in vehicles?
Level 1 is what most of you will probably have in your car at the moment. Level 2 is if you've got a Tesla or something like that. Level 3 was what we were dabbling with at Christchurch Airport. Level 4, I don't understand the difference between level 4 and level 5, but in New Zealand they're kind of hopes and dreams levels because we simply don't have the digital environment to be able to support that in New Zealand at the moment.
And a question here, did you consider putting the non-autonomous bus driver on a bike?
No.
No. Okay. All right. Sorry, we've got one more heavyweight question. Industry, government, and public are all on the same page. The International Society of Automotive Engineers defined a common language and standard. Will it work?
Look, it's really challenged at the moment because ultimately activists are pitting standard of living against the climate. That puts you in a binary position. You need actionists in this world, people who can drive a transition, an energy transition. But don't for a second think that every economy, every country that we trade with is not going to look to use climate change as a competitive advantage. And that's the biggest thing that New Zealand faces from a threat perspective. We're a trading nation and we need to be part of setting those rules to make sure that we don't get disadvantaged.
Thank you, Malcolm, and thank you very much for coming. I was a bit worried when you said you were going to have a test before leaving Vancouver, and was totally delighted when you said you were okay. So
excellent.
Welcome and thank you very much, and congratulations on the work that you're doing. It's world leading. Thank you.